Hi, welcome to Making Meaning, the podcast that does deep dives into hot topics. I'm Bett Bollhoefer, and I'm going to be your host and moderator today. I'm joined by Dan Burfoot and by Victoria Perez. So let's go ahead and start. Today we're going to talk about free speech. Free speech. This is a very, very hot topic. And what we're going to be talking about is the history of free speech, and then we'll move into the modern era. And then how can we change the future of free speech and take responsibility for our own ability to speak and be heard. So we're going to start with history, and we're going to be looking at spiral dynamics. If you're not familiar with spiral dynamics, please check the show notes to learn more. It's a really great framework for how to think about different topics. So we're going to be looking through spiral dynamics today and free speech, and we're going to be hosting a conversation here with my panelists. Let's start with Dan. Dan, when you think about the past, and we can go way back, wherever you want to start, thinking about free speech in the past, what comes to mind, first of all?
Well, thanks for the question, Beth. Obviously, the great moment in history that comes to mind is the church's persecution of Galileo for promoting heliocentric belief systems, the physical system that said that the sun was the center of the earth. And of course, Catholic Church didn't like that and persecuted him. Now, I think that if you really dig deep into the history there's a lot of subtleties, there's a lot of nuances in what was actually happening. I think it could have been a case where they wanted to make it look like they were really going after him to deter other people from following him, but I don't think they necessarily punished him as harshly as some other people. Like, he wasn't burned to the stake or anything. But it's an iconic moment, I think.
Victoria, you are a Roman Catholic. Is there anything coming up for you? Do you want to defend the Roman Catholic Church, or at least give their point of view, steel man? What was the Pope thinking exactly with Galileo's situation?
Okay, so what's coming up for me is it's a few things. So generally people will attach themselves to different movements or value systems or religion to give them a path of some kind of development or guide to live their life. And so it's interesting sometimes being a Catholic, because there's a lot of things that I love and appreciate of what it's taught me and how to treat people and our neighbors. And then there's things from a really uber historical standpoint from the beginning of time that is just not really aligned with how I would live my life today. Right. So there's a little bit of, I don't know. I feel like there's pieces of my religion that I appreciate and I love and adore. And there's pieces that I'm not aligned with, and I'm okay with that. And it's not going to rule or make me feel bad or make me go against something else. Does that make sense? And so I find it, I mean, history's like, I find it fascinating. History's fascinating. I love it. And I always like to think about, I'm reading this book right now. It's really deep into communism. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting, because with the facts that they had at the time and the knowledge that they had at the time and where they were in the world, did that make sense for them? It probably did, right? So it's really easy to fall into different paths or places or religions or things or gods, whatever you believe in. Because in that time, did it make sense for that people? I'm sure it did. And I'm sure there was like good reasoning why this did and why that happened. So I don't know. I mean, that's probably like a real loosey-goosey answer, but that's what's coming up for me. It makes me think about what were the information people had at the time. Did it make sense for them? And sometimes things do. I mean, I mean, we'll talk about present time right now when freedom of speech in a little bit, but a lot of things I'm like, okay, does this make sense for right now? Does it? Or is this, I don't know. That's my answer.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when I was a child, I was raised Orthodox Presbyterian, which is a different denomination of Christian church. It's interesting also how few people even understand church history, but my father was a pastor and I think still is partly a pastor, and he taught us a lot of church history. One of the things that he taught us a lot about is the early printing press, the Gutenberg Bible, and all the different people who were put in prison for distributing the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very interesting concept when it comes to free speech. The Bible was something that, certain Catholics back in the day, and I know, Victoria, this is not your mindset, and you don't need to defend I don't want to defend all of Christianity. I also am not following Christian religion anymore. But it is interesting to see how threatened those leaders at that time were of the Bible. And my father taught me as a kid that it's because the Bible told each individual that they could directly talk to God, and the Catholic Church religion was you have to go through the priest. And so it was a direct violation of their belief system. And so they really didn't want people to read the Bible, and they tried to stop them. So this is it's really good to just zoom out and look at something like
Mm-hmm.
that as a paradigm of today, who's in power, and maybe what are they trying to stop us from doing or hearing or seeing, and why? Because, I mean, the Catholic Church earned a lot of money. And you think about Martin Luther, the original Martin Luther, he nailed his 95 Theses. I knew there was a reason I studied church history. One day it would come in handy. I
One
could
day
put
would
on
come in handy
on
for
a
a panel.
podcast here. So 95 Theses, and he was really talking about the corruption of the Catholic Church and how they were taking money to basically not annul, but give penance for criminals. So if a rich person wanted to cheat on their wife, for instance, or rob somebody, or maybe even murder someone who is inconvenient to take their land or whatever they're doing, they could buy a something and get forgiven, and God would just wipe that sin right off because the priest got a donation. So you can sort of see the corruption there, that those priests didn't want everyone to know that this was happening. And so those 95 Theses that he tapped up on the doors were very threatening to him, and everyone was like, no, don't talk. No, we don't want to talk about that. So let's bring in Dan. Dan, were you raised with any religion, Dan? I actually have never heard.
I'm a non-practicing. My family background is Christian, but I don't practice myself. But I respect Christians. And I did want to comment on the 95 Theses and Martin Luther. Clearly, the Catholic Church had corruption. I mean, any big social institution is going to have corruption. Does it have more corruption than we have today? I don't know how you measure that, to be honest. Clearly, we have a lot of corruption today. What is definitely true is that at that era of European history, Europe was changing the world. I mean, it was an amazing place. It was going through all kinds of innovation in the arts, innovation in commerce, innovation in science. So yeah, on one sense, the Catholic Church did some things that were questionable and you could call it corrupt. On the other hand, you could say that they were doing a pretty good job of managing that civilization.
Steel man. See, that's how you steel a man in
That's a steel
argument.
man. That's right.
So it was the indulgences. I just asked Google. The indulgences were basically, if you needed to knock off someone, just pay a certain fine and then God will forgive you. No big deal. All right. So I like this lens because you can really go back, and another lens that would be interesting to bring in is science. Basically, in the beginning of time, not really, but during the reign of the Catholic Church, they were the master of science And when anyone ever brought up something that was violating their official view of the world, they would be in a lot of trouble. So I would just like to bring that discussion or bring that up now. Does anyone have any thoughts around that specific, how it sort of stopped us from innovating, or at least they tried to stop people from discussing their scientific
I mean, I think
discoveries?
it's exactly the same as what we're seeing today, in the sense
Mhm.
of a certain nebulous category of people. I won't say exactly who they are, but they believe that they have the unique right to talk about certain scientific topics. And if you contravene those topics, if you say they're wrong about that, they're gonna punish you somehow, whether that be ostracism, cancellation. All of these kinds of punishments are on the table. I don't think they put people in jail so much anymore, although maybe. So I see a real parallel from what
Mhm.
the Catholic Church was doing in that era. The real
Yeah.
problem with the Catholic Church in that era is that they're wrong. They're very clearly wrong. So they were staking their authority on something that was just not tenable. Whereas today it's a lot more, the scientific topics we discuss are mostly a lot more nebulous in terms of like who's exactly right, who's exactly wrong.
Yeah. But and that was a time though that they ruled the world. I mean, Catholicism, it just did. But what you said earlier, Dan, like the innovation and controlling certain aspects of a society in when you're in it, living it, it's like this doesn't seem right. But then in hindsight, we're like, well, that was pretty helpful. That did increase this innovation or trickled this idea to go down to this society or whatever. So it's interesting to think about, like, was that the right thing to do, or did it actually lead to other types of futuristic thinking and innovation and societies to grow in different ways or whatever? Like, I mean, I just rewatched the movie Oppenheimer, right? And I was like, it's hard to like, wow, that's an incredible, amazing invention. And that wasn't their intent to use this invention for that, but then it was, and it was like a higher power took control again of something, and you are no longer left to speak your opinion or go against it because you would be canceled, which is kind of what happened to this man. So I don't know. But I mean, we talked about corruption. You brought up corruption and power and money earlier. It takes different forms. I mean, I think we're living in it right now in just a different form, and it's called something different, whether it's called political parties, whether you think this way or not, it's that political party. Um, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think if you try to go into the mindset of someone in these upper echelons of power, historically the Catholic Church in the modern era, the presidents of universities or publishing media organizations, they would be thinking, yes, we're doing a little bit of constraint on the pace of innovation, the pace of dialogue. We're tamping down things a little bit, but it's worth it for the overall goal, the
For
overarching
the
goal,
bigger picture.
maintaining social cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
We are so excited to have Tony Brasunas, author of the new book, Red, White, and Blind, join us. And he is on location in a shed. And this is very exciting. He'll be reporting live, bringing us updates on the gate repair that is happening at his location. Tony, how are things going?
Well, the gate repair is going well. I had to take down the old one because we had a windstorm and it's sort of blowing apart, but I'm reassembling it. Kind of like the way we have to reassemble, I think, our First Amendment freedoms in this country, which is, taking a step back, looking at what the damage has been done, particularly through, I would say, the last 5 to 7 years coming out of the 2016 election, and what that unleashed, this supposed bugaboo of fake news, and how that was actually a disingenuous technique to try to really push down and undermine independent media, the growth of independent media. And then I think during COVID, we saw it ramped up several more notches, and it took on all kinds of other ugly new incarnations in terms of censorship of social media and the whole censorship industrial complex being born, with all this sort of alphabet soup of different organizations at universities and intelligence organizations in Britain and here, working behind the scenes to censor just anything that doesn't go along with the main narrative pushed by the big government agencies and the big corporations. And so we need to protect free speech because it's really what allows democracy and allows science to exist at all.
Well, that's how Tony feels, everybody. All right. So, Tony, welcome to the panel. We are so excited to have you join Victoria Perez and Dan Burfoot here. Okay, so the next topic is the U.S. founding. So let's bring ourselves, we just finished the Catholic Church discussion and how they were really trying to tamper down all freedom of the press and the Bible and all these upstarts like Martin Luther, the original. And now let's talk about the founding fathers. Was it luck, or did they actually have some knowledge about how freedom works and how we can keep a country free for as long as possible when they wrote the founding documents? And let's see, who is, you guys are, by the way, if anyone doesn't understand Enneagram, please go look it up. We have 2 Enneagram 5s with us today, which means they are the professor personality. Yes, we have 2 of them today. And so I really, let's try to reply with a 18-minute monologue, but let's just try to keep it a little more concise today, just so the audience, with the TikTok mindset can keep up. So who wants to take this first stab at, were the founders lucky, or did they actually have something in mind when they were writing these documents?
And I can go if you want. I know I'm sort of joined late, but I think that, and then I'm happy to pass the mic around. I think it's crystal clear. They were coming right out of an experience of tyranny, right? They were in the midst of an experience of, no freedom, this sort of distant far power saying what they could do and couldn't do, taxation without representation. You have the Third Amendment, which is about quartering soldiers. So one of the reasons that we know the First and the Second Amendment so well. The Third Amendment is about you don't have to quarter soldiers in your house because people were forced to allow government officials to come live with you. I don't know if that'll ever come back. I remember there's this time during COVID when there were all these lockdowns, and I read some article about how some visiting scientists were asking to live at some people's. I was like, "Whoa, the Third Amendment could come back in if this really happens." But so yeah, I think absolutely they knew very clearly. And the First and Second Amendment, the whole Bill of Rights, it wasn't written for good times of peace when everybody's happy and we can sit around and have a beer and discuss our ideas and nothing's really at stake. No, it was written for the worst times. It was written for times like COVID, written for times like when you have great economic downturns, or like the civil rights movement, when there's all kinds of antipathy in different groups, and also with colonial powers and things like that. So they absolutely knew that, and I think it was extremely prescient and noble that they would risk their property, risk their lives, risk everything to write a document like that was clearly saying, look, we're done with you, we're out of here. And they knew for sure. And it is to this day, I think, unique in the world. Europe, they don't have the same guarantees of freedom of speech. We saw that in COVID. Canada doesn't have it. Even Australia, they don't have it. So no, it's a big deal, and it's absolutely worth fighting for.
Tony, thank you so much. We're glad you're here. Dan, what's you look like you're about ready to jump out of that chair.
I feel like that was a very strong defense of the founding fathers and the American Revolution, which I'm mostly on board for. But I do want to introduce some nuances here. One is that, again, as I mentioned, talking about the Catholic Church, at that time, the British Empire was really the pinnacle of civilization. And the American colonists were part of that. They received benefits from that. They received military protection from the British Navy. A lot of good advantages to being part of the empire. The Australians, the Australians and the Canadians did not have the same experience of revolution. They were happy to be part of the British Empire. The Australians were actually saddened and felt betrayed during World War II, when it became clear that Britain wasn't going to defend them, even though they were still part of the so-called Commonwealth or empire. So people can have mixed feelings about the empire. I also think that by the standards of modern era, the taxation of those days was not particularly high. So the 3% tax on tea or whatever it was not a really significant economic drain. Certainly taxation rates today are higher than they've ever been in history. So what I think really motivated the founders was that people like the Puritans in particular had done all of this work to get away from the old British establishment. So the Puritans were crazy, and I know this because I'm basically descended from Puritans. They had no idea how to farm. They had no idea what it was going to be like in the New World. They were like, we're going to get on a boat, go set up our colony, and we're going to figure out how to farm, and everything will be fine. Just crazy levels of thinking. But the motivating factor was wanting to get away from the old establishment, the old ways of thinking. And I feel like a big motivation of the revolution was, okay, we did all this work to get away from you people, and you're still telling us that we've got to pay your taxes. So I don't think it was an oppressive level of government overall, but the fact that it was still they still had to pay attention to what these people were saying was really what rubbed them the wrong way.
All right, so Victoria, we've now talked about another old legacy religious group and their rebellion against the Catholic Church, the Puritans. I learned a lot about the Puritans when I was growing up, and they were basically my father's Christian favorite people. Like, basically, that was who we need to learn from, and the work ethic, and if you don't eat, if you don't work, you shall not eat. Basically, I was told that to get my chores done. So, Victoria, what's coming up for you when you're hearing that? Dan basically says it was just a few people who were being oppressed. Most people were fine, and Tony's like all on board and excited. What's coming up for you right now, Victoria?
I think there was intentions of the founding fathers that their experience created and drafted what we have today. I think it was it was experience-like, but it was also, I thought it was also very futuristic. Like, what if things change for the future in this country? What would that look like? We need to think kind of futuristic. That's what's coming up for me. I mean, nothing real. We've seen and heard this dozens of times in different historical periods. Like, it's always one group versus another. I don't think they came to this land thinking it's just going to be us. There's other troubles ahead of us. We don't know what that is, but let's create a document or some kind of laws and rules or principles, really, to navigate those waters. I don't think they came here and thought we are just going to rule this country the way we've always had. I think there was a lot of developmental and experimental things that played into that.
Okay, great. Thank you all for. Let's now move to World War II. So World War II. Now, the founding, America has been around for a little while, and now we have one of the big. Well, World War I obviously was a huge problem. But is there anything that comes up around free speech in World War II with the Nazis, and the propaganda is starting to become really a part of the government? Basically, the Catholic Church didn't really have to worry about propaganda because they had absolute power over your soul. And if you didn't follow the rules, you were just going to go to hell. And now government had to come up with a little bit more procedures, and we have the book. Who remembers the name of the author of that book, The Propaganda?
Edward, you're talking about Edward Bernays?
Edward Bernays. Has anyone read that book?
Yes, I have. And I know my internet connection may not be as strong because I'm out here at the shed, so let me know if it breaks up or anything. So no, I would say you do have to go back. I have a whole chapter in my book, Red, White, and Blind, kind of doing this, going through from the birth of free speech, I would say, which is, or the printing press, and how that led to the dissolution of the Catholic Church's power and feudalism, their hold on power, up through the American Revolution. But then I call the chapter The Century of Propaganda, because it really started around 1915, 1916, and sort of up through the present day. That's when modern propaganda techniques were born. You're coming out of Sigmund Freud, his breakthroughs, and some of the breakthroughs in psychology, cognitive psychology, and mass psychology. And it was Sigmund Freud's nephew, the guy Edward Bernays. Had many meetings with his uncle, and he was working during World War I. He had several organizations that were put together by the government to basically sell the people on getting involved in the European war. And there was, not very much interest in it among the people. I mean, it's always been the case. The people don't want to go to war. It's the leaders who are actually going to stand to gain that want to send everybody off to war. And so you could just study media just through that one lens and get a really good view of it. All on Ukraine, through the wars in Iraq, all of that stuff. It's always the same. But yeah, at that time in 1917, 1918, so Edward Bernays began, and it was very effective. They honed these techniques of basically talking about, and you can even go back a little earlier, what was called yellow journalism around the Spanish-American War in like 1898, 1900, when those first media empires were fighting, and they basically launched that war over Cuba based on, it was one of the early false flags where they said that the USS Maine had been bombed, but in fact there's a lot of reasons to believe that the Americans either bombed their own boat or they allowed the Cubans on board to bomb it. But that's another story. That phase, though, is really fascinating because you have Edward Bernays comes out, they're able to sell World War I, and that begins what we now call public relations. And that begins, so it became corporations started hiring Edward Bernays, military and governments needed to all have these sort of propaganda instruments. And you have this whole series of wins by the public relations industry early in the 1920s and 30s. I document some of it in my book. You could do a whole other book on it, how he convinced people that bacon and eggs was the best breakfast. Nobody before ate bacon and eggs. The color green, nobody liked the color green in like their houses or that painting, sold that. He sold women on smoking by basically tying smoking to feminism. And it was this crazy thing. Women never smoked until that point. And obviously smoking is not a sign of feminism. I mean, it's damaging your body. But through very careful and creative use of public relations, they use the Statue of Liberty with this like cigarette and all this stuff. So it's fascinating. That whole phase of the 1920s and 30s is the birth of public relations, the beginning of propaganda. Yeah, and then by the time we get to like World War II, and then you have like things like George Orwell writing 1984, where he's envisioning an entire society run through public relations and lying and revising history and all of those kinds of things as an outgrowth of that whole early phase, what I call the first half of the century of propaganda.
Yeah, well, it becomes very sophisticated at that point. Yeah. So what I was thinking, so when you were talking about this, Tony, what's the difference between marketing and propaganda? Right? There's
not much difference, right? I mean, public relations was just this idea that we're going to use propaganda techniques on people to buy our products. And then it became even more sophisticated as it became how you deal with, your corporation does something bad, like, Dole in Central America, where they're like basically indicted, they're shown doing all these awful things. They bring in the public relations like, oh no, we're helping the people. We're helping the poor banana farmers, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's very
and the invention of Mad Men in New York.
That's right.
I mean, that took over. That's wild propaganda.
And it's funny to watch that. 1 second, Dan, I'll bring you in. To watch that show Mad Men, which I think everyone should watch, it just seems like the public was so naive. Like, we're just so much more sophisticated now. But that was really cutting edge at that time. So, Dan, what's coming up for you right now?
Well, let me just say that I don't think the public is more sophisticated now than we were in 1950. I think the American public is not doing great. I agree. But what I wanted to say is that what's really surprising about the propaganda thing, which is sort of the application of advertising techniques to public truth, is that it works, right? You can use these very sort of superficial techniques and people will eventually start to go along with it. So it's sort of more plausible to believe that if you advertise some consumer product, toilet paper, toothpaste, whatever it is, some very basic thing, and people don't have enough time to really sort it out themselves, so they'll just be like, all right, I'll buy your toothpaste. But the fact that it works for more significant decisions and more significant facts is just the real astonishing thing. There's an interesting tie-in to the opioid epidemic, and the original, the Sackler family, which had Purdue Pharma and produced OxyContin, they were started by a guy who did medical advertising. And that was a shock too, because nobody would have thought that medical advertising would work, because everyone thought that your doctors are very serious scientific professionals, and they did all the research and figured everything out. So an average person is going to listen to their doctors, and the doctor is going to give them the right medication. But no, in fact, medical advertising works really well. The doctors are very easily influenced by magazine ads.
Every other commercial on TV is a pharmaceutical ad.
Yeah.
You know, that all shifted, right, in 1997. Up until that time, pharma was not allowed to directly advertise
to consumers,
drugs to consumers. And so you didn't have pharmaceutical commercials. And then that was part of the big deregulation era under Clinton, where they deregulated telecommunications, and the FDA basically got in bed with big pharma and they negotiated where they would allow drugs to be advertised on television. And that's a really interesting thing. I don't know if we're going to get there, but that's a really interesting moment in the transition of the two political parties, where it used to be up through the 80s and the 90s, the Democratic Party was really the party of the working class, party of unions. They got most of their money from unions and from trial lawyers, and they weren't getting money from big pharma. They weren't getting money from the oil companies or the big weapons companies and things like that. And Clinton really began the shift. And then you saw in the early 2000s, it was still sort of the Republicans and George Bush and Dick Cheney that were launching the wars. But things really shifted, during the next decade. And so now we're really sort of seeing how that all came to pass. And I really do think 2016 was a real watershed year, because you saw in that year, the Democratic Party had put in place these superdelegates and all of these sort of stopgaps to prevent the populist revolution happening in their party. And so Bernie Sanders was stopped through all kinds of, by hook and by crook and all kinds of devices. But the Republican Party hadn't done that. Because they had been always a little bit more friendly to business, and I don't think the Republican Party thought that it would be a vehicle for populism. And so, so Trump came in and he was allowed to win because it wasn't as shady. They didn't have as many things thrown in the way. And so Trump was able to take over. And now we see the Republican Party is now the party of the working class. You go talk to Joe Sixpack, he's going to be voting for Trump. You see that the Republican Party is not advocating for war and for big pharma anymore. If you're anti-drugs or vaccines, you're probably going to be on the right, complete opposite of where it was 30 years ago. And that's because there was this huge shift. And the big shift, that wasn't the only one for sure, but that shift in 1997 to allow pharma to advertise, and that was done by the Democrats. Pharma began to slowly move towards the Democrats. And now, pharma spends more on advertising than anyone else. And advertising, we're just talking about public relations, that's advertising. So when Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson buys an ad on MSNBC or Fox, they're not doing that just because they want to advertise to consumers. Sure, that's part of it. They want to be able to control the agenda of what's spoken, of what's talked about on the show. So they become the dominant advertiser, the dominant funder.
Yeah, it's buying power. Okay, the other thing that's coming up for me, Bett, real quick, before we go to the next topic, if you want, is why does propaganda, it seems like, have a negative connotation and marketing is a positive psychologically for people, right? It's just marketing. It's just advertising. But then you put that word propaganda in there. It's like, whoa. This isn't propaganda. It's just a commercial. I wonder about that a lot.
It's a meta question, right? Then that's propaganda working on your brain. And I would say it's fairly straightforward. It's because during the Cold War, propaganda was what the bad guys did. And what we did, propaganda, the bad guys had, behind the Reds, the communists behind the Iron Curtain, they did propaganda. They wouldn't allow freedom. You couldn't have Pepsi and blue jeans. And so they're bad. But over here, we tell the truth, and we sometimes have our advertising and marketing, but those are all good things. And so it just plants this idea in your head.
It plants a seed of negativity.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And I would love to say that, oh, I wrote a book about this and I'm smart enough and it doesn't affect me. No, it does. Like, you just check your own brain. Like, you say a name like Slobodan Milosevic. You're like, why do I have this negative thing about this guy? He was like this Yugoslavian leader. He was trying to basically set up a free economic system for his people. But because I was propagandized before I had consciousness back in the 90s, he was this evil guy, I didn't even really read the news. I just knew that he was this evil bad guy, you know? And so all of these things you have to realize, like, where did that come from? Why do I think propaganda is good or bad? Or why don't, right? It's because and these techniques are extremely sophisticated now. They've been around for a long time. And you can see it in like if you see, you're just talking about an ad that says, hey, buy this toothpaste or buy these blue jeans. And you sometimes notice these quaint, here's why my product is better. And it's so kind of adorable because when we watch sophisticated advertising by like Budweiser or a car company or, you know, it's never about their product. It's all about this whole lifestyle thing. Like if you remember the frogs that would croak and then there would just be a Budweiser logo at the end, or a car commercial where it's all about like freedom, because they realize that they're not advertising their product. They're doing this like sort of programming of your brain to associate positive things or negative things with a certain product. So they're not telling you about the qualities of their product anymore. Yeah, it's really
like Apple think different.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle. Just do it. Mm-hmm.
But one of my favorite examples of legacy propaganda and the legacy of propagandistic efforts that have been carried forward to today is the word crusades and crusader. So the word crusader has a very positive connotation in most people's usage, but like that's really crazy, right? Because the crusaders were actually super evil and like racist and anti-Islamic. So the fact that it still has a positive connotation is a legacy of that propaganda effort carried out 1,000 years ago or something.
That's amazing. So let's wrap up this section of history with talking about these books that came out of that era, like the 1984s and the farm. What is it called? Animal Farm, Brave New World. We have Fahrenheit 451. These books were telling us very clearly a newspeak. We're going to reduce the number of words that you can say. We're going to memory hole is the current word, but we have the Ministry of Information back then in 1984. My parents told me to read these books, and I'm wondering if kids nowadays are being told to read these books, or if they're saying, people are like, no, don't read those books anymore. That's for something in the past. What's coming up for when you think about these very critical books that came out of that era?
Before we answer that question, does anybody here, do we know what curriculum books are being pushed to kids these days, or not really?
I'm about to learn. I mean, I have a 7-year-old and not even a 1-year-old yet. And so I'll learn through Corin, but he'll definitely be reading these books. I mean, I get a lot. I just reread 1984, maybe a year and a half ago, or maybe it's during COVID. I don't remember. And there's still a lot to get. It's a brilliant book.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous amount of, George Orwell really packed a lot of wisdom into that book. So yeah, no, I think there's still a lot to learn from that. And I'd say, if anything, it's more useful now than ever, because we're now at a time where those technologies exist. I mean, when he talks about that screen that was spying both ways, or he's talking about, you know, this kind of alcohol that's like not really alcohol, all these different products, like we're in that era right now where these things exist, where surveillance is happening. I mean, our cars are spying on us and all these kinds of things. It's absolutely happening right now. So we have to decide, are we going to take a stand? And the other thing that's interesting that I think people forget, or think I grew up believing, was that, you know, and there's tremendous danger from extreme right or extreme left. So I came up on the left. I came up as a lefty thinking that the greater danger was from extreme right, which there is extreme right. But you read Orwell, and he saw it as coming from the left. Like that's English socialism, right? Ingsoc is like these socialists that came up and sort of took over power. And that's where we are, I think, right now, is we're seeing this sort of consolidation of power and sort of pushing of censorship and the sort of war how they talked about 1980 war, where we've always been at war with East Asia. We'll always be at war. Now we're at war with Eurasia. We've always been at war with Eurasia, right? Like Russia and China. You kind of see that happening now. I think
a little bit. It's like a rebirth of when you read books when they come out, and then you read books 10, 15, 20 years later, I think sometimes realize, it's the same things. It's just kind of a different rebirth of it happening in a different way, a different form, a different name, but it repeats itself. It does.
It's the same processes and patterns going on.
Yeah.
By the way, Tony, I object to your parents teaching you of education that I could neglect that it could be plausible that you wouldn't realize the extreme left is a terrible threat to humanity. I mean, they clearly did much worse in the 20th century than the extreme right. But one note I made about this dialogue was that on the subject of the parties switching side is at Berkeley. I used to live in Berkeley, California, and there's a famous, Berkeley was the center of the free speech movement in that era when it was anti-war and anti-Vietnam. And there's this great little plaza in the center of Berkeley campus called the Free Speech Plaza. And there's a little cafe called the Free Speech Cafe. And it's got a plaque with Mario Silva, who was the leader of the student movement. So all of these things have now reversed because Berkeley is no longer a place that gets passionate about free speech. It's now a sort of progressive bastion. And of course, the progressives have very mixed feelings about free speech.
Why? It's
well, we'll get into that. We're gonna dig in, guys, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so let's do a quick lightning round just before we close off the history. What have we discovered, and each of you gets about a minute to summarize about the importance of free speech to bring us to where we are today as the humans that we are? How has this history with the Catholic Church, Edward Bernays, all these different things happening, where are we right now with freedom of speech? Just to summarize, lightning round, let's start with Dan. Has it been important, Dan?
Oh gosh. Well, yes, I think it's super important, but I also want to, I also want to observe, remember, I like to steel man the bad guys, quote unquote, bad guys. It can be dangerous. And one example of that was the witch hunts in America were basically very downstream of the printing press. The printing press happened. Somebody wrote this crazy book about how witches were all over the place and were going to bewitch you with their evil eye. And 100 years later, people were like, oh man, witches are a big problem. So we got to start burning them. So free speech, yes, it's deeply important. I think it's something that it's a risk you have to take, right? As an adult, as a child, you don't take risks, but you don't have as many experiences or as much potential. As an adult, you have to take risks, and that comes with dangers. And I think that's very much what free speech is about.
All right, Dan and Victoria, summary lightning round. How important has free speech been to the success of humans so far?
If we think of free speech in a sense that you want to hear it all to make informed decisions for yourself and for your family, it's been incredibly significant and helpful and incredible. I love it. Little American, I love free speech because I want to hear what somebody opposite of me is thinking so that I can test my own biases and knowledge and learn more and validate or reflect whatever it is I'm working with. So I want it. I don't think it should be canceled or it should be muted or whatever the social media word is for like hiding things from me. I want it all. I want all 5 ways of thinking. I want to hear it all so I can make an educated decision for myself. So I think it's been incredibly significant. And it kind of worries me where we are right now in this country with it.
Well, we're going to get there next, Victoria. And Tony, where are you on free speech? Do you feel like it's been overall good, or has it been detrimental for the human history so far?
I feel like you know what I'm going to say. I think free speech is the First Amendment for a reason. It's placed first because it is the single indispensable right from which all others flow. You don't have free speech. Free speech is essentially free thought. Like thought and speech are closely linked. So if you say you can't free speech, it's like, oh, you can just think it in your head, but you can't say it, right? So yeah, absolutely, free thought is the fundamental right. That's in 1984. It's very clear in all of those books. And I would say free speech hasn't just been good for the United States and the countries that have had it. I would say that it is the distinctive competitive advantage as well that we had during the Cold War and even before that. Obviously, the United States has other advantages. We have two coasts. We have a lot of abundant natural resources. We have a diverse population. We have a lot of advantages. But you would say that, the Soviet Union and like the people behind the iron, they had a lot of coasts. They had a lot of natural resources. They had a lot of smart people. But they didn't have the freedom of expression. They didn't have the freedom to experiment, to come up with ideas, decide that the other ideas are better. When you have this marketplace of ideas, that's where democracy, you can make good decisions as a people. And also things like science and innovation can flow, because innovation always happens at the edges. You always have an incumbent that like the car works this way, or the house, we build it this way. Innovation comes from the edges. Somebody comes up with a better idea. But if all the power is here and you don't have free speech, those innovations aren't allowed to take over. And then you have a competitive disadvantage because you can't actually innovate. So I would say free speech is the competitive advantage that has set this country apart, along with many others. And I want to say one other thing, which is, as Dan said, to point out that free speech is not all good. It's not just this pure good. Because to support free speech doesn't mean just supporting, other people having different opinions and you get to chat it out. Free speech is supporting somebody you despise saying something you think is absolutely dangerous and anathema to your entire being. That's what it means to support free speech. And of course, hearing that stuff is bad. It's not fun to hear somebody say something about who they hate or somebody who should die or something. Those are bad things to hear. And we know that from kindergarten. We teach our kids not to say things like that. But the problem is, if you try to do that at a societal level, whoever you put in power to decide what's okay and what's not okay will always be corrupted and will be always put will always become a servant to power. And so that's why free speech is so important. And it is extremely dangerous that we're eroding that freedom today.
Yeah, I think that you guys have all brought up really good points. And thinking about church history and thinking about how the Catholic Church had a worldview that was very safe for humans. God was in charge, earth was in the middle, everything followed these rules. There was a priest you could go to, and they would give you indulgences if you had to knock off a neighbor to take their land. I mean, not a big deal. It was safe for humans. It was very controllable. And now if you think about how the Catholic Church is just one of the other religions you can pick from, and they don't make any decisions for most of us. And now we have a lot of different ways of looking at the world. And, it's not a safe world. It doesn't feel as safe as it did. And that's scary. So, but we should be able to be free to know the truth about how the world really works, even if it does feel scary in the beginning. And as we grow as humans, and one person, I think it was Tony said it earlier, consciousness. This is a word we haven't really talked about in this conversation, but really when we expand our understanding, listening to other opinions, debating how the world works, we actually are raising our consciousness. So that's, I think, what we should be doing as humans. Our goal is to raise consciousness and expand consciousness, all of us, and that's awareness. So we need to know the truth, and we have to get there through trial and error and discussing what we're seeing and hearing other people's points of view, because the elephant, we're all touching the elephant in different parts. So I think this fierce debate is sometimes uncomfortable when you find out that the priest is not the person that's going to, I'm sorry, Victoria, if you still believe in that, but the priest is going to bless you and take away all your sins. It's scary. but I really think it's critical for where we are. All right, we're going to now move to the next round, and that is the rise of the internet. So the rise of the internet, and I think very critical. It's not just the internet. And by the way, I think a lot of us are in technology in some sort. It's really the mobile phone. It's really the mobile phone and the internet that have changed our world, and maybe social media. We can all just debate. But we're going to now talk about how the internet and mobile technology and the web and Web 2.0, or whatever we want to jump into, how has that impacted free speech? The ability to publish without gatekeepers. And we can really go back to Gutenberg and say, in the beginning, you used to write down things by hand, and then Gutenberg came along with the movable type press. And we're really just moving closer and closer to making it zero cost to publish. And that's a big change. So now that we are able to, all of us have a blog, all of us have a YouTube. I have like 4 YouTube channels. Right? We're able to publish, but what is the impact on free speech? Let's hear from someone. Dan is being very quiet today. Dan, let's give the floor to you to weigh in on the ability to publish without gatekeepers.
Thanks, Bett. I feel like I am talking a lot, but that's all right. I love to talk more. I think that what's interesting, well, it's hard to say something interesting about social media because a lot has been already said. Obviously, this guy, Jonathan Haidt, is talking about how it's making all young girls depressed and causing terrible mental health problems. That's a big issue. A lot of people are saying it's causing political polarization. And I did want to say about that, I think the US is a different place than other countries because I don't think other countries have had as much polarization happening as the US. So if you go to Iceland, if you go to Switzerland, places like that, Finland, you don't see this bitter division of one side against the other that we're seeing in the US. So that, I think, is worth bearing in mind. In terms of being able to publish and get your ideas out, yeah, I think the established authorities are very afraid. I think a lot of the turmoil we're seeing is the death throes of the legacy media companies, New York Times, CNN. All those people had this huge empires built on the fact that they own the distribution channels, they own the publishing channels, and now they don't anymore. So they're dying, and they're in their death throes. They're like thrashing around and causing a lot of damage to innocent people. And one more comment is just that historically, free speech was always a little bit moderated by the fact that publishing was an undertaking. So you couldn't just go to the New York Times and say, hey, publish my manifesto, right? Like they're not going to publish it. You can't just go to a publishing house, say, here's my book, send it to the world. They're not going to publish it for you. So that was an intrinsic moderating effect on the spread of ideas, and it forced people to ratchet down, I think, a little bit what they were saying. It forced people who are really crazy to effectively, they wouldn't be able to distribute their ideas as well. But now there's really no gatekeepers anymore. You can be the craziest person in the world and your ideas will go out there just as easily as anyone else.
Dan, thank you. Victoria, hot take. Victoria, over to you.
Well, I mean, I think most simple example is, I say will it because I know Instagram doesn't show me certain things. And I know Facebook, he just admitted that he, was censoring stuff. So I don't know. It's like, am I getting all of the content I want to get, or is it being controlled for me? Sure, I follow certain accounts, and I follow certain accounts on purpose because I want to see the other stuff, but I never see it. It never comes my way. So I don't know. It kind of breaks my heart. I wish it was more free. I think freedom of speech in conversation and community with people is alive and well. This dialogue and conversations with friends and families and folks you meet at restaurants and these kinds of things, sure. But from a social perspective, from the internet, pushing it out and then being able to receive it, I think is questionable at this point.
Tony, what's coming up for you right now?
I have to go in about 10 minutes. That's the first thing, or 15 minutes or so. I got to get back to the gate, and I got my daughter and things. But no, so this is a great conversation. This is absolutely right up my alley in terms of like why I wrote the book, Red, White, and Blind. And so what I talk about in the book, and I think I'm not the first to point this out, but I think it's fairly clear and becoming clearer that we're in the beginning of the next Enlightenment. So I think you've maybe talked about that before I joined. So the first Enlightenment was birthed by the founding of the printing press and what that led to, and sort of it began sort of the slow unraveling of the power structures that existed that were top down. And you said that was a safe world. It was safe as long as you didn't want to, you know, take over the feudal lord's position or call into question, or you were okay with being sent off to war at any moment, and you know you're okay with the system, then it was safe. But it was not safe if you had any type of heretical ideas at all. And so what we tried to do, I think, what the founding fathers of the United States and in that era, what the point was to build a society that's actually safe for divergent views as well. And so you have majority rule with minority protections, all these kinds of things. And now, yes, the internet absolutely has birthed the next Enlightenment. And we're in that phase right after Gutenberg was like distributing the first of his Bibles, where the existing arbiters of truth, the existing people that own the top-down dissemination of information, are not happy about it at all, because that is a tremendous power, the power to tell people not just what's happening, but what you should hope for, you know, what's good and what's bad, who are the heroes, who are the villains, you know, what is the purpose of your life? What are you living through? COVID is this big, you know, awful thing, or COVID's not a big deal. You know, the virus came out of a lab. The virus came out of a wet market. Like the ability to tell people it was this and not that. It's this and not that they had. It's tremendous power. It's more power than money can buy you. So absolutely, like Dan was saying, the death throes of dinosaurs is what we're going through. They're thrashing around, and they're going to be calling everybody that is trying to build up the new independent media, which is already here. It's unfolding. It's not perfect. It has a lot of issues. But they're going to be calling that fake news and misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, whatever labels they can throw at you. And it is dangerous. Because, yeah. I mean, and I don't know. I wish I could say that for sure independent media is going to win. Free speech is going to win. We're all going to be in a better place. And it's this apocalypse where suddenly we're learning that JFK's assassination and 9/11 and the COVID vaccine, all these things were not what we were told. And we're going to continue to learn things like that. And it's going to piss people off and people are going to be upset about it. But I hope that we're in the beginning of the birthing of this new civilization where there's a broader awareness of truth. And it's not just top down. It's like you said with your phone, it's peer-to-peer truth. It's, I just saw what's happening over here and I can show you right now. You don't have to wait for it to bounce up to the New York Times, for their CIA Operation Mockingbird to decide it's okay. And then it's a pass over to the guy who's going to, you know, sell the newspaper at the newsstand and he doesn't like what's there. No, it's going to be direct peer-to-peer. And I'm very excited about it. And I'm also very concerned that, you know, the people opposing it are going to stop at nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So, Tony, you have written a great book. I highly recommend it, Red, White, and Blind. But don't leave, Tony. We are going to move to what can we do? The future. Let's move to the future. We talked about the internet gatekeepers, you know, still the algorithms are there. And I think coming from Verizon, I worked at Verizon for 10 years. I worked at GE for 5 years. I actually worked at Meta, don't hate me, for almost 2 years. So I've worked in these kind of big corporations, and we thought a lot about net neutrality when I worked at Verizon. When you think about net neutrality, I know people like want their eyes glazed over, but that basically means where are you sniffing the traffic? This is very technical. Where are you sniffing the bits as they go through the routers? And we see things happening right now with the CEO of Telegram being arrested in Paris, France. We have X, as the recording of this is happening, X has been banned in Brazil. I don't know what the latest on that is, but the algorithms are now the gatekeepers. They stop us from seeing things. Victoria is talking about, I'm not seeing it. So we can all say things anywhere, but we have shadow bans, we have outright bans. A sitting president was banned off of a social media, maybe many social media platforms.
All of them.
That's very confusing if you think about who's in charge. So the algorithms and AI are kind of the future, but what can we do and how can we think about law and code? I'm throwing in a lot of stuff here, but just as the final part of this conversation, I do want people to leave this conversation empowered to go and do things that can help, and whether that's rioting, I don't know, like with little signs, or it's changing platforms. Like, I don't know where are you guys coming on this, the future of free speech. And maybe Tony, you can go first since we went Dan first last time.
You go first. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I do the same thing in my book. Like this first 2/3 of it, I basically tell you how bad the problem is and sort of lay out the history and the history of propaganda and how sophisticated it is, how we've been misled into wars and into all kinds of awful things. We don't know the truth about very many things in our life. But then I don't want to leave you in this place of like disempowerment. There's actually a real positive trend. I think that we are in the beginning of a very positive trend, that the internet is a way, it does enable a lot of bad things too. It enables surveillance, it enables all kinds of real potential evils. But I think it's a net good. I think it enables people to find each other. It enables people to express themselves. And to the extent that they aren't being censored, it's very powerful. So what I recommend is a balanced media diet. That's the first thing I recommend. And so I have a website, balancedmediadiet.com, where I propose a balanced media diet. And I'm looking always for people to help me put it together. So maybe Bett or Dan or, anybody that's watching this, or, if Victoria, you want to join, I'm always looking for new voices to help, because I don't want to, if I just come up with the balanced media diet, it's like, well, was it balanced if just this Tony guy came up with it? But the idea is that you commit to a balanced media diet the same way you commit to a food diet. And you try to overcompensate towards the healthy stuff, but then I still allow some of the junk food, some of the like Fox News and MSNBC and NPR, because for a couple reasons, because we want to understand what the culture is thinking and what they're going through, and because it's a constant exercise to hone our own bullshit detectors. Like, you don't just learn it once and then you're done. There's new bullshit every couple months, right? Or every day. So by learning, okay, this is what they're saying about this. This is what this other group is saying about, like Brazil is banning Twitter right now, or X, right? And Elon Musk is saying this about it. They're doing this. Reading different sides about it. It's very important in terms of our own internal, I call media consciousness, like building media consciousness. Something like a balanced media diet, I think, is extremely helpful. And so I put that in the book, and I'm building a website. Eventually, I want the website to be something you could push, have push notifications to your phone, and here's your balanced media diet for today. Here's your couple sources. And I have a lot of grand visions for it. So if anybody has free time and loves engineering, just let me know.
Very, very nice. So personal responsibility, basically you're saying we need to be intaking every viewpoint so that we can at least know what's going on.
At least 2 viewpoints. I mean, every viewpoint is, but at least 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 if you can, because the minute you have 2 viewpoints, you can start to understand that there are many, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful, and I force myself after reading Tony's book to listen to a lot of different sides, even when they make me go crazy. And I'm like, Dan, what do you think? Laws? What do we need to do here to help us continue having free speech into the future?
Yeah, a couple points. I'm less optimistic than Tony. I think that the main trend of the modern era seems to be the consolidation and the stagnation of political systems. I think that the U.S. political system is very stagnant. It hasn't changed in decades. Although, Europe is definitely stagnant. Europe has both stagnant political sector and a stagnant economy. At least in the US, we have a good economy. China hasn't changed, doesn't show signs of change. So I'm not optimistic that our political systems are going to get better, even if many of us become some sort of widely knowledgeable, widely informed citizens. However, I still think it's probably worth it to do that for the sake of your own individual personal thinking and ability to perceive the world. I think that the badness and the corruption of our political discourse is really seeping into our individual decision making. So people make bad decisions about their own lives because of ideas that they got from their political propagandists in the media, in the universities, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Switching topic a little bit, I think that there's an interesting aspect of algorithms and virality that happens in the social media world, which is that the most impactful posts and content are the ones that go viral. So the ones that get millions or tens of millions of likes and views. You can, the censors don't actually have to censor those posts completely. They can just cut down on the virality piece. So if you say, okay, I don't like this post, but I'm not going to prevent people from seeing it. I just don't want it to get 10 million likes. I'm okay if it gets 10,000 views, just not 10 million. That can be 99% as effective at censorship without actually deleting the post. So I think there's an interesting angle there. In general, I think we need new principles. You know, free speech is a good principle for pre-internet era, pre-algorithm era, pre-AI era. But I think we really need to get new political concepts developed and built into the political systems. But again, I'm pessimistic because I don't see that happening. I don't see political philosophers appearing who have new ideas and well, there are the philosophers. No, that's true. They just don't have the ability to get their ideas adopted.
Mm-hmm. Unless everything crumbles down to the ground, then it needs to be rebuilt, and it'll be rebuilt differently.
Yeah, that's
it could crumble. We don't know.
$35 trillion in debt and counting.
So Victoria, where are you landing on this? And the things we can do?
Yeah. So I'll keep it simple, right? For people who are listening or out there, we're like, what do I do? I think sometimes it can be, I like Tony's advice. I do that. It might be overwhelming for some people to, okay, I have to go look at this idea and I have to go read that idea. And okay, now I think about it. It's a little bit for people who are like, I just want to be told what to do. That could be overwhelming. So I would say, if you can manage it, do Tony's suggestion. If you can't, be intentional to have conversations with people who think differently from you. I have a lot of friends. I have a big circle of friends and family who think very differently from me. Be intentional, have a conversation with that person. It doesn't have to be about a particular topic. It doesn't have to be about politics. It can just be about anything, because their diversity of thought and them communicating something to you could help you think differently about something, or check yourself, or validate or help you reflect on something that you're struggling with. So I would take a step back and have a real conversation with intention with somebody who thinks differently from you. It's the most simplest thing you can do.
I love it. Okay, so we're going to be wrapping up here, and I want to say something that follows along with what Victoria just said. And I would say, whenever you start talking to anyone, don't make any assumptions. Don't make any assumptions. Just say, like, what are you hearing about this? Or how are you feeling about this thing that just happened? Because I think when people start making assumptions and they say something very, like, excitedly about some specific thing in the world, it kind of closes the door for conversation. Instead, say, how are you feeling about whatever topic? What are you seeing in your life? And I think that's a much better way to converse, especially as we go into the holidays and there's an election happening sometime soon. So I think it's just better to go into all conversations with curiosity versus going through and just being like, well, can you believe blah, blah, blah? I'm so angry about it. And so I think that's just for sanity purposes. All right. So today was our first episode of Making Meaning, and we're going to have lots more episodes coming up with different panelists. So if you want to be a panelist, you can message me. I'll put information in the show notes. I want to thank our panelists today. Please buy Red, White, and Blind. I'll put notes in the show notes about the book. The audiobook just came out, right, Tony?
Yeah, the audiobook is out just last week. So the audiobook was just released. The print book and the ebook have been out for a while, but please go check them out, redwhiteandblind.com. You can also go to my Substack where I talk about it, which is redwhiteandblind.substack.com. Yeah.
Excellent. And Dan Burfoot, do you have anything you want to plug? You have a blog you're writing?
No, thank you. I have things I want to plug, but not in connection to politics.
Awesome. And Victoria, anything you've got going on that you want to share?
Yeah, if anybody's interested in integral theory, check that out. Give it a Google. That's it.
Absolutely. Integral theory really helps us kind of zoom out and see the bigger picture. And we're going to be bringing that into our conversations in the future. All right, with that.
Dan.
I just thought of what I want to plug. If you are a libertarian, if there are any libertarians listening to this podcast, you should think about moving to the state of New Hampshire to join the Free State Project. This is a movement of libertarians all converging on one state. Obviously, there's not a lot of libertarians in the world, but if we all go to the one state, we can maybe have an impact. And it's working to some extent. There's a lot of people in the state legislature that are liberty aligned. So think about it.
There you go. Everyone move.
Very cool.
All right, everyone. Have a great time. See you next time. Bye.